In Magic the Gathering, each card has a card type, be it land, creature, planeswalker, and so on. Sometimes a card will also have a subtype to help denote some flavor or mechanical function. While some subtypes like equipment and auras are mainstays of the game, other subtypes are far more obscure in their application. Today, we're going to go over 10 of the weirdest subtypes Magic has to offer. Starting off at number 10, we have Arcane. This subtype from the original Kamigawa block was designed to denote the instant and sorcery spells used by the spirits of the plane. Arcane by itself doesn't give any particular effects to the spell. Rather, there are multiple ways cards interact with Arcane. One such example is how Kamigawa block included several cards that trigger whenever you cast a spirit or arcane spell. In this way, Arcane appears to be a predecessor of sorts to Tribal, a card type meant to denote non-creature spells direct tied to a creature type. Beyond this, Arcane also had further gameplay application thanks to the ability Splice onto Arcane. When you cast an Arcane spell, you may pay the splice cost of a card with Splice onto Arcane to add the card's effect to the Arcane spell. So, if you're casting Crack the Earth, you may pay 1 generic and 1 blue mana to splice Evermind in your hand onto it. Kodama's Reach now has the bonus effect of drawing a card and Evermind stays in your hand to cast later or to splice onto more Arcane spells. While novel, it's an inherently parasitic design space, not to mention a slightly confusing one for players not used to a spell staying in hand after using its effect. Arcane as a type required cards to focus on it at the cost of other similar spells. The distinction of what was and wasn't Arcane didn't really boil down to anything directly tied to game mechanics. It was a purely flavor consideration. Adding Arcane into spells thematically tied to spirits meant Splice onto Arcane was later considered too narrow and Splice was reworked into a seldom used Splice onto instant or sorcery. And once a spell has the subtype Arcane, it can only be printed into products or sets where spirits are a theme. This led to instances where a card like Kodama's Reach would have a nearly functionally identical counterpart in Cultivate, since there would be no narrative reason for an Arcane card to exist in the set, or simply because a single instance of a subtype in a standard set might confuse newer players. While a novel attempt at trying to give more thematic binding to cards in a block, in practice Arcane only served to clutter and confuse. But this is because Arcane was one of the earliest examples of specifically trying to tinker with design space of creature type synergies on such a wide scale. This means though Arcane was a misfire, it's less egregious or strange than the other entries on this list. And at number 9, we have Siege. Siege is the first and only subtype for Battles, a card type introduced in March of the Machines. As a Siege enters the battlefield, you choose an opponent to protect it. You and other players can attack the Siege, and when it's defeated, you can exile, then cast it transformed. Usually a subtype will serve to mechanically denote when a group of cards have a specialized function not shared with other members of the card type. One example of this is how every equipment is designed to attach to a creature. Thus, every artifact that does so is classified together as equipment. In the case of battles, there are currently no non-siege battles. Until a new kind of battle is introduced, this means that the subtype in a siege is entirely a flavor one. That isn't the only thing that makes siege strange, however. Although you choose an opponent to defend the siege, you still control the permanent, making sieges the first and only permanent its own controller can attack. Sieges put your opponent in a spot where they have to pick between expending resources to keep you from defending the siege, or just letting you have the backside of the battle. Your opponent gets no active benefit from defending a siege beyond the fact you'll want to attack it instead of said opponent, or delaying the spell in the back half of the battle. Since these sieges have defense counters instead of life, they are also susceptible to interactions with cards such as Vampire Hexmage, which can remove counters. Battles, despite their name, don't need to be taken out in combat. You transform a battle whenever it has no more defense counters, no matter the reason. As such, Invasion of Ikoria can grab a creature which removes its counters to instantly transform into its backside. That backside just so happens to be Zilortha, Apex of Ikoria, an 8-power creature that allows non-humans to deal assigned damage as if they weren't blocked. Synergies like this make sieges an interesting card type despite there being so few of them at this time. Unlike other card types on this list, however, it's actually quite likely we'll see more sieges, or even other battle subtypes. As the newest card type in Magic, it only makes sense that battles would see further support, and in time sieges might not seem any stranger than something like equipment or vehicles do today. But for now, it remains a somewhat strange subtype in the face of what had come before it. And at number 8, we have Lair. Lairs were a non-basic land type printed in Planeshift. There were only 5 officially sanctioned cards with the typing Lair, one for each of the primeval dragons that had been printed in the preceding set, Invasion. Each Lair taps for 3 colors corresponding to the color of the identity of their dragon, such as Treva's Ruins tapping for green, white, or blue. When a Lair enters a battlefield, it must be sacrificed unless you return a non-Lair land to your hand. While Lairs are fairly unimpressive compared to newer options, for their time they were nothing if not forward-thinking. The invasion block was one of the earliest examples of a set focused around multicolored cards. Beyond just a high number of gold multicolored cards, the set also introduced a focus on cards that cost one color and then have an extra cost or bonus ability of another color. While multicolored cards and support for them weren't entirely new concepts, invasion block and the layers that came in it helped pave the way for further standardization of decks using various colors of mana, not to mention the future sets that would carry on with the focus on multicolored design. Ravnica cites the invasion block as one of the heaviest influences on design, even though Ravnica focused more on 2-color pairings than 3. As his focus on multicolored design continued, layers did not see any proper return. There are simply more effective ways of fixing your mana that don't set you behind on lands. Fetch lands are ubiquitous in any competitive format where they're legal, and mana-producing creatures and artifacts put you ahead on mana instead of setting you behind. Even in the purposefully silly comedy set Unhinged, the R&D secret layer did not receive the layer subtype. And even if the card were to be errata to be a layer, the card's effect is to play cards as written and to ignore all errata, meaning there is functionally no way for R&D secret layer to ever be a layer. Of course, this is the unset card, one that is not legal in any actual formats, but the oversight does show how little care was given to layer. Beyond this, the set named Ikoria Lair Behemoths contained 0 layers. Not even the spell You Find the Villain's Lair has any actual reference to the card type. Layers are so forgotten and antiquated in the realm of Magic that their name has been co-opted into something else entirely. Today, if you mention the word layer to a Magic player, the first thought would most likely be Secret Layers, a type of product bought directly from Wizards of the Coast. While Secret Layers have dwarfed the actual card type, which was already obscure even before it had something to compete for its name, they are also the source of the only technically new layer in well over a decade. Wizards occasionally produces unofficially sanctioned cards for employees to commemorate a project or specific team's accomplishments in a program called Heroes of the Realm. As such, when Secret Layers proved to be a success, some members of that product team were given the Secret Layer. Despite having no mechanical synergy with prior layers, it does indeed have the land type, proving that layers are certainly forgotten, but not entirely gone. And at number 7, we have Gold. This subtype was introduced in Born of the Gods and only appeared on tokens of the same name. Gold can be sacrificed to add 1 mana of any color. At a glance, these might seem to be a reskin of treasure tokens, with the only difference being that you must tap a treasure token before sacrificing it for the mana. Since non-creatures don't have summoning sickness, there's no direct downside to needing to tap treasure tokens. Instead, there are marginal upsides to Gold not needing to tap. The most notable is the synergy with Improvise, an ability which allows you to tap artifacts to pay for 1 colorless mana of that Improvise spell's cost, or any other spells of tapping generic artifacts for mana. This means you could tap the gold to help pay for the Improvise on one spell, then sacrifice it for mana to cast another. This interaction was far from broken, but it was hardly the most intuitive. So when Ixalan was in development to come out after Kaladesh introduced Improvise into Standard, it was determined that Gold would need a slight rework. By creating treasure tokens, it both circumvented the confusing interaction plaguing Standard and also allowed Magic to have a more generic mana-producing token. Gold only works narratively in a set if the plane it takes place in has gold, whereas treasure can be rethemed into any sort of treasure on any sort of plane, leading to a much wider adoption of the subtype into general set design. This, however, has left gold high and dry as something of an archaic card type. Gold and treasure are functionally different enough that they didn't just errata gold to be treasure. However, this means cards like Academy Manufacturer just flat out do not work with gold tokens. As such, despite the marginal upside that gold has, it's safe to say that treasure tokens are the stronger of the two simply because of how much more support they've gotten. Curse of Opulence was the last proper card to produce gold tokens, and since then it has been nothing but treasure tokens. Even cards that could in theory count as gold to produce gold tokens instead are treasure or produce treasure, such as Goldhound, which is a treasured dog despite having gold in the name. The success of treasures has made gold into a forgotten subtype that only really had a few sets before it was swept away by its vastly more popular successor. And at number 6, we have Cartouche. This subtype only appears on auras, meaning it's a subtype for a subtype. There are only 5 Cartouches in Magic, 1 for each color, which all appeared in Amonkhet. Cartouches represent passing the different trials of the plane's gods, and as such, directly synergize with said trials cards. Every trial has an effect where whenever a Cartouche enters the battlefield, you may return the trial to your owner's hand. Each trial enchantment has an effect when it enters the battlefield, such as Trial of Knowledge, drawing 3 and then discarding 1. As such, it incentivizes sequencing your plays so that you maximize value, and sometimes saving a Cartouche more to reset a trial than to directly enchant the creature itself. While not really constructed playable, the Cartouches proved instrumental to the makeup of Amonkhet as a limited format. Each Cartouche provides not just a buff to the creature, but some bonus effect whenever the Cartouche enters the battlefield. For just a single white mana, Cartouche of Solidarity would create a 1 power 1 toughness warrior that doesn't tap to attack, as well as giving the enchanted creature plus 1 power and toughness, and the first strike keyword, which allows it to deal damage first in combat. This not only developed one of your threats, but also created a new token to help chump block or pressure for damage if your opponent was open. Cartouches in their trials were openly designed for limited, and despite being well received, don't have the widest design space going forward. The most open part of its design space, specifically auras, which provide a bonus effect as their bust for a creature, have seen further experimentation success without returning to the Cartouche's card type. In an article discussing the likelihood of mechanics from Amonkhet returning, while Cartouches have a chance of reappearing on their own, the specific interaction between trials and Cartouches is something Wizards only really envision for Amonkhet, and would not be likely to be seen unless it was a set that took place in Amonkhet's past, due to the trial system no longer existing on the plane. The further Magic drifts away from Amonkhet, the more obscure Cartouches get, serving as little more than a novelty with slight hopes of a reintroduction in the future. And coming at number 5, we have Urzas. The actual subtype did not come into existence until 8th edition, where it was retroactively given to a group of lands from antiquities called the Tron lands, or the Urza's lands to use their official name. These 3 lands were all named after Urza, the character who owned the territory in the lore. These cards worked so that, if you controlled Urza's Mine, Urza's Tower, and Urza's Power Plant, they'd each tap for extra mana, with 1 copy of each of the 3 lands adding up to a total of 7 available mana. This led to the name Tron, as playing the lands together felt to some players like assembling the robot Voltron from the show of the same name. When these Tron lands were reprinted in 8th edition, it was decided that they could use a templating overhaul. The original abilities were worded to specifically list all 3 Tron lands together in the ability text. By updating the lands to have subtypes, the cards could now reference recurring typings instead of exact names. While not the most dramatic change, it does save on space in the card's text box and created 4 subtypes in the process. Beyond Urza's being its own subtype, Mine, Tower, and Power Plant also became their own subtypes. The creation of the Urza's lands types also eventually led to further experimentation with cards. Urza's Saga is a powerful land from Modern Horizons 2 that has the unique quirk of having a name identical to its subtypes. Urza's Saga is an enchantment land that has the Urza subtype and the Saga subtype. This makes it not just a quirky card, but also the only enchantment land in the game and one of the most complicated lands to actually play. As recently as Brothers War, we've even seen some experimentation with the Urza's type, with Urza's Workshop actively even playing into the Tron playstyle by tapping for colorless mana equal to the number of Urza's lands you control. While many of the flavorful subtypes that exist come about due to experimentation in Magic's earliest days, Urza's as a subtype is almost the inverse. While trying to clean up some old flavorful cards, the most efficient and clean way of doing so was to create subtypes that still see attention to this day, albeit very seldomly. And at number 4, we have Trap. Traps are a card subtype introduced in the original Zendikar block. Traps are instant spells that have a reduced mana cost as long as your opponent has taken a specific action that turn. Usually the Trap's effect is meant to counteract or undo whatever action your opponent did. Needlebite Trap costs 5 generic and 2 black mana to make target player lose 5 life and you gain 5 life. However, if your opponent gained life this turn, you can only pay 1 black to use the effect instead of its full cost. As the name implies, traps are meant to punish your opponent for doing particular things. If your opponent is playing a graveyard strategy, it's very likely they'll mill several cards of the graveyard in 1 turn. As such, Ravenous Trap not only is free to cast when several cards have entered your opponent's graveyard, but it also exiles said graveyard when it's cast. Not every trap was so effective, however, with many being extremely narrow effects that wouldn't even make the cut in most limited decks. It's notable that, although we've only seen 1 version of traps printed, the design team experimented with several variants that never saw the light of day. The earliest iteration of traps were artifacts that were played into exile face down, and they could be cast when your opponent triggered a certain condition. While this version of traps is closer to another kind of trap card from another card game, it was shelved and eventually reworked into the foretell mechanic. Other versions of traps considered were permanents that would enter the battlefield for free if the opponent did something, but sacrificed themselves at the next end step. Neither of these versions of traps ever came to be, and we've not seen any new traps since the set Worldwake. Cards that become stronger or cheaper in response to opponent's action are nothing new in the world of Magic, and will exist for years to come, although it's likely that the only new trap cards you'll be seeing anytime soon are going to be in Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 3, we have Attractions. Introduced in Infinity, Attractions are a subtype of artifacts that represent the various activities at the Space Carnival the set takes place in. Infinity is another unset, meaning that the cards bend the flavor mechanics of the game of Magic for a comedic slant. First and foremost, these are not cards that go into your actual deck, instead going into their own separate deck called the Attraction deck. While they are artifacts, they don't have a mana cost and go directly to the battlefield whenever a card opens an attraction. An attraction has a row of numbers on the right side from 1 to 6, and with some being blacked out. During the beginning of your next main phase, if you have an open attraction, you roll a 6-sided die, and visit any attraction who does not have that number blackened out. Attractions have abilities that trigger when you visit them, such as Roller Coaster, giving creatures you control +2 power until end of turn whenever you roll a 5 or 6 when visiting an attraction. The idea then is to open multiple attractions to not only increase your chances of visiting an attraction no matter what result you roll, but also to visit multiple attractions at the same time if the attractions you have out share a number. Some attractions, like Pick a Beeble, offer a prize based on meeting certain conditions, such as having enough luck counters on the aforementioned Pick a Beeble. Unlike other unsets, Unfinity was designed for a large number of cards within it to be legal in sanctioned formats. As such, attractions are generally less wild than some other unset original designs. You can build a deck around attractions in Commander that is completely legal without any house rules by running the Most Dangerous Gamer, which is a black border legal magic card. Attractions are strange and silly, however, they're a very deliberate instance of silliness. Attractions were balanced with their quirks in mind, so while they are quite bizarre, there's a level of intent that makes it less absurd to picture. Attractions were always meant to be a bend into weird with a very set goal in mind. The same can't be said for the others on this list. And at number 2, we have Fortifications, or rather, Fortification. That's because there was only one single Fortification All of Magic that was printed in Future Sight. This was a highly experimental set that aimed to take curious jabs at what future card designs might look like in Magic, with the idea that we were going to see cards in the future that would eventually get printed into the actual game. While this did eventually happen with cards like Aven Mind Sensor, many of the designs from Future Sight remain nothing more than playful ideas than anything actually developed. This is where Fortifications comes in, as a subtype that has to this day not been revisited at all since the printing of Darksteel Garrison. This artifact costs 2 generic mana and can fortify a land for 3 generic mana. When you fortify a land, you attach Darksteel Garrison to target land you control at sorcery speed. This makes Fortifications essentially an equipment, but for lands. The fortified land is indestructible, and whenever it's tapped, target creature gets +1 power and toughness until end of turn. Since Darksteel Garrison is the only card of its type, there's not much to talk about in the realm of how the card type has been treated over the years. It's been said that its design space is seen as too narrow and in conflict with auras that enchant lands. While creatures themselves do the attacking and thus benefit from direct stat boosts, lands, however, don't do much beyond tap for mana. While there are certainly design applications such as protecting a land or helping your creatures indirectly, that's far less fertile ground for design than one might expect, especially when auras often handle protecting lands or altering their effects. As such, Fortifications have been left by the wayside entirely and are unlikely to ever be returned to. And finally, at number 1, we have Contraptions. Much like Fortifications, we learned about Contraptions in Future Sight. However, we didn't actually see what Contraptions were for another decade. Future Sight saw the printing of Steamflogger Boss, a goblin rigger who made it so riggers assembled 2 contraptions instead of just one whenever they would assemble a contraption. The set contained no contraptions, and no further explanation on what they were, leaving Steamflogger Boss a creature with essentially superfluous text. This changed almost exactly 10 years later with the release of Unstable, the third unset. This was still when every card in unsets was silver bordered and thus not legal for tournament play, and thus the official yet not officially sanctioned debut of Contraptions as a proper card type. As a subtype of an artifact, they're quite similar to Attractions in that they exist in their own Contraption deck and have no cost. Instead, whenever you assemble a contraption, you draw the top card of a contraption deck and put it onto the battlefield onto one of the player's 3 zones called sprockets. During your upkeep, you move the crank counter 1 sprocket to the right, starting with 1 and looping back after passing 3. Whenever the counter moves, any contraption on the sprocket it moves to triggers their ability. Attractions, in a way, can be seen as the reined-in version of Contraptions. Whereas there's a certain level of randomness to Attractions, you're able to sequence and set up exactly what contraptions you want to trigger and when, as long as you draw them. Beyond this, Contraptions, thanks to being unstable, are not legal in any actual sanctioned formats. Steamflogger Boss is the only black border card that references Contraptions to this day. In fact, when they reprinted Steamflogger Boss in Unstable, it was printed on the basic land sheet instead of on the main set because it was the only feasible way for it to exist in the set in a black border. Contraptions were the inspiration for Attractions, which were very deliberately a weird mechanic. Contraptions in turn were included in Future Sight in 2007, then never brought to fruition until 2017. And even then, they were only in a comedy set where the only constructed legal card that mentioned the subtype was in the basic land slot. Contraptions were literally a punchline a decade in the making, even if they weren't always intended to wind up in a joke set when Steamflogger Boss was first printed. That eventual fate not being predetermined only makes Contraptions even more obvious of a pick as the weirdest subtype in the game. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other subtypes you feel like were worth an inclusion, or any other topics you'd like to see us discuss? If so, let us know down in the comments below.